Which brings us to the great transformation of our times, which is the so-called controversially dubbed Great Convergence between Eastern and Western GDP or economic development, and all of the cultural exchanges and political shakeups that implies. And this is inevitably a major development in the history of religions as well as anything else. So I'll just provide some definitions here. So the Great Divergence is the description of the gap in economic development between primarily Western European powers, and particularly the British Empire, and the economies of East Asia, which had formerly been at parity with the West or had exceeded the West's growth in certain epochs. So the Great Divergence specifically describes the growth of per capita incomes triggered by the Industrial Revolution in Britain, which then spread to Western Europe and continued in a mitigated form until the early 1970s. It was a pan-European process in which Britain began to emerge as the leader in the second half of the 17th century. The Great Convergence, meanwhile, is a term which was coined in 2015 to describe the convergence between the economies of East Asia and primarily Western Europe, initiated in the 1980s by the Information Revolution, spearheaded by the so-called tiger economies of East Asia, such as Japan, China, and now increasingly also India. In longer term, the term Great Convergence refers to the weakening of the world system's core in the United States and England, France, and Germany, and the strengthening of the periphery. The focal point of this so-called Great Convergence theory is, of course, the rivalry between the United States and China, and the economic core, or the sociological core of that rivalry, is the convergence of the living standards of the Chinese middle class with those of their American counterparts. So this, as I mentioned, is a political and economic transformation, which is profound in the history of religions precisely because one could not conceive of two regions of the Afro-Eurasian continent which have such dissimilar religious groupings. One can think primarily in the Western case of the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and the smaller varieties like Baha'i being predominant for most of the establishing a strong presence in the first millennium, let's say that. And in the Eastern case, we're thinking of Indic religions, what are termed by Western scholars Hinduism, which is itself a kind of a category term, but also Sikhism, Jainism, Buddhism, especially in China and Japan, Confucianism, Taoism, etc. And there is, as we alluded to earlier, at least one major categorical distinction between these is with respect to ultimate reality, which is a term used by religious scholars to refer to what religions reference as the most real or important aspect of existence, which for the monotheistic religions of the West has traditionally been called God, and in the East has been referred to differently as things like Brahman or Tao, and in the case of Buddhism, nirvana, mukti, liberation. And there is a fundamental difference with respect to these conceptions of ultimate reality and all the consequences they have on how these different cultures conceive of value, both personally, interpersonally, at the social level. So there is also, of course, the so-called global north and global south, which, broadly speaking, global north refers to northwestern Europe, which we just covered with our West designation. But specifically, it is above, I get these mixed up, it's above the Tropic of Cancer, generally speaking, if I'm not mistaken. That's kind of the line where the United States, North America, and Europe go. And the global south is above the Tropic of Capricorn. This global south is also broadly what is referred to as the periphery of the world economic system, whereas the global north is that which is referred to as the core. And the great convergence between East and West here, Western Europe predominantly, East Asia predominantly, is referring to a transformation within the core in terms of which economies have the highest GDP per capita or GDP growth and other primary economic indicators. This was begun with Japan overtaking Germany as the second biggest economy in the world in the 60s, and then what happening with China in the 70s, and now India is projected to take that spot. triggered by population growth and economic policy and other things. So I'll start with a question for Sotiris. What does the growth of the Christian churches in the global south mean for the future of Christianity as a world religion? And do you believe that East Asia will continue to be a region in which Christianity and Islam play a relatively minor role in politics as they have historically? Or do you see signs that may be changing?
Well, I'm not quite well versed to respond to the second question, but as far as the first is concerned, it is very interesting that, you had the historical nests, for example, of Christianity. Europe practically, and then America. But now this has changed radically. The gravitational center point, as it were, of Christianity isn't Europe anymore. And you can see that in many ways. For example, even by the fact that you don't have a European pope, if memory serves, from the very first time in history, a Latin American pope, etc. So it's easy for us in the Anglosphere or whatever to say that Christianity is receding, it's declining. Yes, it is declining in our countries. It is not declining elsewhere, and it is acquiring new forms in Africa, in Latin America, and it remains to be seen. Well, apart from the classical, from the old Catholic presence in Latin America, now you have also Protestant evangelicalism on the rise, etc. And you can see there how things are in the process of changing, of giving birth to new types of Christianity, of simmering through what is essential and what was simply cultural during the first 2 millennia of Christendom, etc. So there's much to see here. But I would like to offer a remark on your introduction, as it were. You spoke of the great convergence. I had the very great joy of working on a book, unfortunately in Greek, a magisterial book, in my opinion, by Dimitris Peponis, a fellow Greek, which shows very meticulously that it's not the great convergence, but the end of the great deviation. What do I mean by that? That it's been 2 centuries now. Ferdia had that in a lecture in Athens, by the way, at the academy, if you remember. So the end of the great deviation, because the last 2 centuries, give or take, were a historical exception, or if you'd like, a historical anomaly. A historical anomaly where the center of economy and power in the globe was in the 2 shores of the Atlantic, beginning with the British Empire, then with the American Empire, etc., etc. But this was a new thing in the history of the world, even if we cannot really understand that due to being bespectacled in a very Western and Eurocentric way. Okay, let me share a graph with you. This is from the aptly named website Visual Capitalist. Obviously, there are names of countries here which are anachronistic, quite obviously, for the past. But you can see, grosso modo, 2 millennia of economic history in one chart. Note that this axis, it goes after 2 centimeters, it goes from 1 to the first millennium, and then, and then it goes to decades. So normally, if it was more straightly arranged, the great deviation, which here is half of the graph, would be but a tiny bit, 2 centuries. You see, there's a sheer economic size, as it can be estimated by historians and historians of economy, of what is today China and India, by the way, the 2 greatest population states on Earth, with 1,400,000,000 inhabitants each. Compare that with the population of Europe, which was as important as it was in the 19th century, also population-wise, etc. And see how from 1 CE up until practically the beginning of the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, and you can see here, that the great deviation starts where countries like the United States, etc., have more economic power, and how this ends. So, GDP, by the way, nominal GDP must be quite a problematic metric to start with. Purchase power parity, GDP might be more interesting. And purchase power parity, now China is the first in the world for a number of years, and it will be also nominal GDP in a number of years, whereas the economies of the Western alliance lack commodities, lack resource. Their economies are not built on resources. They are not commodity-based economies. So I don't see any convergence coming. I see the end of the Great Deviation. And all the concepts and notions and conceptualizations and thought cages that we discussed about during the last many minutes are a product of that Great Deviation, are a product of the beginning of the Enlightenment, of the preponderance of British thinkers during the British Empire, and then of an American-centric mode of thinking. All this will not be at the center of attention soonish, because, there's a difference between developments in global economies, in global political systems, in how people think, etc. It is important, though, to say that, just to give you an example, an example of this end of the Great Deviation, for 2 centuries now, it had been inconceivable to think of the emergence of a non-Anglophone, non-Atlantic, non-liberal, non-bipartisan, democratic bipartisan state as the planet's largest economy. This is now just around the corner. Actually, it has already happened as far as PPP is concerned and China. So you can see these huge metamorphoses that will have an impact on the decline of also an intellectual world that had the auspicious claim of universality and trans-historical universality, as our world was. The world of the Great Deviation, the world of modernity, and particularly of the 19th century onwards. And because we mentioned also, this is my very last remark in the interview, in the discussion, because you also mentioned, religion, theocracy, etc., and how the East thinks, the Far East, etc. We have a tendency to think secularity, etc., arriving after advancing from a Middle Ages of thinking religiously, etc., and arriving at a modernity and a progress that is distinctively European and scientific, and so on and so on. Let me just remember some words from Wei Zhang's 2016 book, The China Horizon, Glory and Dream of a Civilizational State, in which he mentions a story. He was in the Hague, etc. There was a discussion which is not of our concern here. And he responded to a question. To answer this question, one must first of all have an insight into the origin of Western modernity. Not far from here, this assembly hall, are 2 places worth visiting, Wei says, one being the former residence of the great Dutch philosopher Baruch Spinoza, and the other the Royal Delft. Back in the 17th century, he writes, when most of the European states were theocracies, from a Chinese perspective, Spinoza was said to have had a secret meeting with German philosopher Gottfried von Leibniz in this city. Together, the 2 philosophers discussed one of their shared findings. Other than a theocracy, China was a secular state, or a state of modernity then. They were confident that China was a successful state as it followed a secular, natural, and non-theocratic way of governance. I'll not quote further. What I'm trying to say is that in our imaginary, we have arrived at the first phase of the pinnacle, or not of our civilization, but of civilization, which is science, secularity, rationality. The end of history in Fukuyama after the fall of the Soviet Union and the beginning of the short unipolar moment, where liberal democracy will be the norm for everybody, etc. And that we arrived at this by ourselves due to the merits of Western civilization. And then you see that that some of the fountainheads of enlightenment, like Leibniz and Spinoza, would back then look to China as the counterexample worth imitating. Isn't this an interesting historical episode from the past in view of today's end of the Great Deviation.